Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
In a recent conversation with an atheist, I asked him what his basis for morality was, to which he responded, the scientific method. Um, I didn't quite see how the scientific method could provide obligation. Um, I thought it was just more observation. So I asked him what the obligation was, to which he said empathy. And after listening to your STRU class, um, on morality and the part on obligation, I don't really see how empathy, though while important, does not provide um, an obligation for morality. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on either one of those, either that the scientific method is the basis for morality, or that empathy provides the obligation to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Oh, you're welcome, Angela, and a very thoughtful question. Um, and I love questions like this because this question is tied to an argument for God that I love, is very powerful. And there's some aspects of it that are a little bit hard to get sometimes because you have this crossfire like this. But it's the moral argument for God, and the argument is very simple, and that is if there is no God, there's no objective morality. But there is objective morality, and by the way, I secure the truth of that premise by the problem of evil. That is the complaint. There is objective morality in the world. Okay, so the second premise is, and but if there is objective morality, there is no God. There's no way to ground it. God's the only grounding for that. Okay, therefore God exists. Okay, that's the argument in its simple terms, as it were. And the rejoinders are things like this: the scientific method provides a basis for morality. Now, I just want you to think about the words: a basis for morality. All right. Now let's follow an illustration here. Um, if there are speed limits on the roads and highways in your community, what is the basis for the speed limits? Oh, well, there are people in our community just make signs and put a number on it and stick it up. Well, that's how you can get a number on a sign. Is that does that create a morally or a legally obligatory obligation? That's a redundancy, I guess. A legal obligation. Is it obligatory? No, obviously, because the citizens, individual people making their signs and putting in a number on it is not an adequate basis for legitimate speed limits. What is the adequate basis? It's the local government. It makes sense. I'm not talking like objective morality. I'm just talking about the notion of basis. All right. So if thinking in larger terms now, we're looking at the whole moral project. What is the basis for that? The argument I offered was that God is the only basis. God is an authority like a government who gives directives and commands to which we are obliged. We have an obligation to obey. Well, that all makes sense. It may not be true, I mean, for the sake of discussion at the moment, but do you see that that all fits together? This makes sense. This isn't just some guy putting up a sign with a number on it. It's the God who is the authority over everything who tells us the way things are supposed to be. Well, that makes sense. All right. That's the basis from my perspective. And somebody says, not so fast. The scientific method can provide a basis. How does the scientific method provide a basis? So Angela's observation was spot on. Scientific method entails observation. It doesn't entail obligation. That's an important distinction. The scientific method is, in a certain sense, a mechanical method. It's a way to accomplish something and learn something. So that's like saying, I'm just trying to think about, okay, if I want to make a fried egg, I get a frying pan, get some butter and an egg, crack it in under a flame, and then when it's almost done, I flip it over. Actually, that would be not sunny side up, but over easy. That's the way to get an over easy fried egg. That's a mechanistic process to get it accomplished. Now, what have I said? Well, making a fried egg is a basis for morality. And you're going to look at me and say, huh? How does a mechanistic process that produces some result be the basis for morality? Well, it's not. Because that kind of thing can't form the basis for it. All right? So there's tremendous confusion there. Scientific method dictates no moral obligation of any kind. Nothing about the scientific method can give us that. So then, when questioned, the atheist says, well, empathy. Okay, how does this relate? I guess he's thinking that empathy is a basic moral principle that then can guide our behaviors, and we use something like a scientific method, a methodology, that helps us to know how to express empathy or how to accomplish empathy in the lives of other people. I guess I'm trying to give this the most charitable read possible because I think it's a very confused thing to say, which is why Angela, as you could tell it in her voice, was a bit confused by his responses. Okay? If a person says that the foundation for morality is empathy, what they have done is smuggled in morality to form the foundation. And then are prepared to give examples of empathy in action. But you can't explain the foundation or the basis, what makes something moral, by just simply asserting something moral. Why is empathy moral? Now, I could say, because God says we ought to be empathetic. Well, now you have an authority giving a command that we're obliged to follow. That at least is a coherent way of understanding the moral foundation or grounding, and empathy is resting upon that grounding. It is not the grounding itself. Empathy is an example of the kind of thing that God may want us to do. It's a good thing, and when we do that good thing in a variety of different ways, then we are obeying and we are living virtuously and accomplishing good. But do you see, when somebody says empathy here, they are presuming that empathy is a good to begin with and that we ought to live it out. No, I don't disagree with them that empathy is a good, but it is not the basis. The basis, that's like saying what is the basis for speed limits? These signs made by people sticking them up on the highway and spray painting a number on it. Well, that's the sign, but it isn't the basis. The basis is the person who, as it turns out, has no authority to expect compliance in that situation. Therefore, it has no incumbency. It has no obligation to it, to obey it. Same thing here. You could say empathy. Well, empathy maybe is the guide, all right? Maybe empathy is one of the moral guidelines, but it is a moral guideline, and what we're asking is, what is the basis of any moral guideline? Not give me an example of a moral guideline and find clever ways using some kind of methodology that you might call the scientific method to figure out how to apply empathy in different circumstances. Now, I think this is, like I said, sometimes hard to follow. And the reason it's hard to follow is because moral truths are obvious, but moral truths are not the grounds for themselves. And if people seize upon a moral truth, like empathy, a moral good, I should say, they think they've done their job. There it is, empathy. Sam Harris, the atheist, one of the so-called new atheists, not new anymore, 20 years old, does the same thing. Well, obviously, human flourishing is the basis of, is everybody agrees that human flourishing is a moral thing, so we can determine how to flourish better by using a scientific approach. So he employs a methodology that he's going to call a scientific methodology to help us flourish more, because flourishing is good. But he doesn't say why flourishing is good. That is, what is the basis for it? We know it's good. That's not the question. It's not how we know it. We can know the speed limit by looking at the sign. The question is, who put the sign up there? My neighbor with a spray can and a piece of metal? Then I don't have to obey it. The government? That's different. They have the proper authority to do that, and they can enforce, and they do. Okay, so we're asking, what's the basis for human? What underlies the claim that human flourishing is the way that we can is the foundation that we work from to establish our morality without God. Incidentally, there's something else going on here. Not only is, in the case of Angela's circumstance, the atheist smuggling in empathy as a moral good, which moral good itself needs to be explained. That's the very kind of thing that needs to be explained. But Sam Harris is doing the same thing when he smuggles in morality called human flourishing. Well, obviously, human flourishing is a foundation for morality. It is a foundation for morality, I agree. But it isn't the basis. I should say it is a foundational moral good, is the better way to put it. But it isn't the foundation on which the moral good rests on. Says who? Why human flourishing and not like porcupine flourishing? Why not that? What makes humans so special that we have an obligation to help them flourish? And by the way, what the heck does that flourishing thing look like to begin with? So we have an issue here. The idea of human flourishing presumes that human beings are made for certain ends, and they flourish more as they more closely approximate those ends for which they were made. So what is automobile flourishing? Well, it means, all the pistons firing in a certain way, smoothly together, all these parts moving so that when you get in and you push your foot on the pedal and you grab the steering wheel, you drive somewhere. Those are scientific elements, if you will, physicalistic. What if only 6 or 4 or 2 pistons are firing? Well, you're not going to get where you want to go very well. Okay? But that's the teleology. That's the goal of the vehicle. Human flourishing is the goal for humans. But what does human flourishing look like in detail? The Third Reich had an understanding of what human flourishing looked like, or at least what the Volk flourishing looked like, the German people, okay? Hitler was looking to expand, have living space, okay? That meant they occupied space other human beings were in, and they got rid of them. Because the Volk, the German people, could flourish better with all that extra land. That's what they wanted. All right? So there is an understanding of flourishing that is teleological, but is very different from other people's understanding of flourishing. So who says what version of flourishing is the good version of flourishing? If you have no underlying basis or foundation for the so-called good of flourishing, you don't know what that is.